The old cemetery on Harborview's hillside was a place most locals avoided after sunset. Not because they feared ghosts. Most townspeople were too practical for such notions. But because the winding paths became treacherous in the dark, and the sea fog that rolled in made even familiar headstones look strange and foreign. Yet lately, something had been drawing visitors there after dusk, something that spread through town conversations like wildfire. It began with two teenage boys who had dared each other to cut through the cemetery on their way home from a late basketball practice. They burst into Joe's diner the following morning, eyes wide, hands gesturing wildly as they described a soft blue light hovering over one of the older graves near the oak tree section. Like something from a sci-fi movie, insisted the taller boy, while his friend nodded vigorously. The waitress at Joe's had rolled her eyes and slid their chocolate shakes across the counter. "You boys been watching too many of those streaming shows," she said with a laugh that didn't quite hide her unease. But then Mrs. Chen, who walked her dog along the cemetery fence every evening like clockwork, reported seeing the same thing. And within a week, the cashier at the pharmacy, the librarian, and the high school science teacher had all mentioned catching glimpses of an unearthly blue glow emanating from the same section of the cemetery. Thomas Walsh had been Harborview Cemetery's groundskeeper for nearly 30 years. At 62, with a full head of silver hair and hands permanently stained with soil, he had seen plenty of strange things in his time caring for the dead. People leaving peculiar offerings, mourners who claimed to feel cold spots or hear whispers, and even the occasional trespasser attempting midnight rituals among the tombstones. He'd dismissed the talk of a glowing grave as just another town fancy, perhaps sparked by those new LED flowers some companies were selling for grave decorations. "Bunch of nonsense," he muttered to himself as he locked up the cemetery gates one Tuesday evening. The coastal sky was already darkening, though it was barely past 7. A fine drizzle had been falling all day, leaving everything with a slick, glistening surface that reflected the dim light of the scattered pathway lamps. Thomas pulled his worn jacket tighter around his broad shoulders and was about to head to his truck when something caught his eye. A subtle illumination coming from the eastern section, where the oldest graves rested beneath massive oak trees. He squinted through the rain-spotted lenses of his glasses. "Must be kids with flashlights," he grumbled, changing direction and trudging up the muddy path toward the light. But as he approached, Thomas slowed his pace. This wasn't the harsh beam of a flashlight or the glare of a cell phone screen. The light was soft, almost pulsing, with a distinctly blue hue that seemed to hover just above the ground. And it was coming from Eleanor Blackwood's grave, a modest headstone compared to some of the more elaborate monuments around it. Thomas stood transfixed, raindrops sliding down his weathered face. In all his years, he'd never seen anything like it. The glow didn't seem to have a source, rather it appeared to be emanating from the very soil of the grave itself, seeping upward like luminous fog that pooled around the headstone. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, the words barely audible above the patter of rain. He approached cautiously, half expecting the light to vanish as he drew near. But it remained, casting eerie shadows across neighboring graves. Thomas knelt beside the headstone, his knees cracking in protest. The marble was cool to the touch, slightly damp from the rain, but otherwise ordinary. The inscription was simple. Eleanor Blackwood, 1915-1973, beloved mother and wife. The truth finds light. The glowing seemed most intense around the base of the stone where it met the earth. Thomas pulled a small pocket flashlight from his jacket and directed its beam at the ground. The soil looked normal enough, though perhaps a shade darker than the surrounding area. There were no electrical wires, no hidden devices that might explain the phenomenon. He stood up slowly, brushing wet soil from his hands. Something wasn't right here, and for the first time in many years, Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp evening air. By morning, Thomas had convinced himself he'd imagined the whole thing. A trick of light, perhaps, or his aging eyes playing tricks on him. But when 3 separate visitors came to the cemetery office to ask about the glowing grave, he knew he hadn't been seeing things. News travels fast in small towns. By the end of the week, Harborview was buzzing with theories. Some claimed it was some kind of natural phenomenon, swamp gas, or bioluminescent fungi. Others whispered about more supernatural explanations, a restless spirit, an omen, or even alien involvement. The more scientifically minded suggested chemical reactions in the soil or minerals that responded to temperature changes. The local paper ran a front-page story titled, "Mystery Light Draws Crowds to Cemetery," complete with a blurry nighttime photograph that showed little more than a smudge of light against the darkness. The cemetery, normally a quiet place of reflection, was suddenly getting more visitors in a day than it usually saw in a month. Thomas found himself becoming protective of Eleanor's grave. He started staying late, watching from a distance as curious onlookers gathered. Most were respectful, standing in silent wonder as the light gradually appeared with the deepening darkness. But some treated it like a carnival attraction, taking selfies and loudly speculating about what might be causing the glow. "Show some respect," Thomas would say, shooing away the more boisterous visitors. "This is someone's final resting place, not some sideshow." It was during one of these evening vigils that Thomas noticed a woman standing apart from the other onlookers. She wasn't taking pictures or chatting excitedly. Instead, she stood motionless, her face pale in the blue light that rose from the grave. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. There was something in her expression, not merely curiosity, but something deeper, something almost like recognition. Thomas approached her slowly. "Evening, miss," he said, tipping his worn cap slightly. She startled, as though pulled from deep thought. "Good evening," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "You seem more affected than most by our little phenomenon," Thomas observed. The woman glanced at him, then back at the glowing grave. "Eleanor Blackwood was my great-grandmother," she said simply. Thomas blinked in surprise. "I didn't realize the Blackwoods still had family in town." "They don't," she replied. "I've been gone 15 years. My name is Cassandra." There was a heaviness to the way she said it, as though the admission cost her something. Thomas noticed her hands were tightly clenched at her sides. "I got a call from my aunt yesterday," Cassandra continued, her eyes never leaving the illuminated grave. "She said people were disturbing my great-grandmother's resting place. I thought she was exaggerating until I saw the news articles online." Thomas nodded slowly. "The light started about 2 weeks ago, far as I can tell. Nothing like this before in all my years here." "And you have no idea what's causing it?" There was something in her tone. Not quite skepticism, but a probing quality that suggested she was used to asking questions and finding answers. "None," Thomas admitted. "I've checked for practical jokes, electrical sources, even those glow-stick things kids play with. Nothing explains it." A small group of teenagers approached the grave, their excited whispers carrying through the quiet cemetery. Cassandra tensed visibly. "Folks are treating it like some kind of tourist attraction," Thomas said apologetically. "I try to keep things respectful, but word has spread." "My family won't be happy about this attention," Cassandra murmured almost to herself. Then, more clearly, "I need to see this grave in daylight. Would tomorrow morning be possible?" Thomas nodded. "I'm here from sunrise. Cemetery opens at 8. Cassandra finally turned to look at him directly. In the strange blue light, her features seemed sharper, her eyes reflecting the unnatural glow. "Thank you. I'm staying at the Harbor Inn. I'll be here early." As she turned to leave, Thomas found himself calling after her. "Miss, if you don't mind me asking, what did your aunt think was causing this?" Cassandra paused, her back to him. For a moment, Thomas thought she hadn't heard him. Then her shoulders tensed slightly. "She thinks someone's trying to dig up old secrets," Cassandra said without turning around. "And in my family, Mr. Walsh, secrets tend to be buried deep." She walked away through the maze of headstones, leaving Thomas standing in the blue glow with a growing sense that the mystery of Eleanor Blackwood's grave was only beginning to unfold. Above the cemetery, clouds parted briefly to reveal a sliver of moon. Its pale light seemed ordinary and reassuring compared to the unearthly blue emanating from the earth below. Thomas looked down at Eleanor's headstone one more time, reading the inscription that now seemed less like a grieving family's sentiment and more like a warning: the truth finds light. Something told him that before this mystery was solved, many truths would indeed come to light, and not everyone in Harborview would be happy about what was revealed. Morning brought a different face to Harborview Cemetery. Gone was the eerie blue glow that had drawn crowds the night before. Under the pale autumn sun, Eleanor Blackwood's grave looked utterly ordinary, just another weathered headstone among hundreds, the granite slightly mottled with age and ocean air. Cassandra arrived just as Thomas was unlocking the gates. She wore practical clothes, jeans, hiking boots, and a dark green jacket with multiple pockets. Her hair was pulled back in the same no-nonsense ponytail as the night before. Thomas noticed she carried a small backpack and what looked like a camera case. "Morning," she said with a nod. There were shadows under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well. Thomas tipped his cap. "Coffee?" he offered, holding up a thermos. She hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks. It was a long night." They walked in silence through the winding paths. The cemetery was peaceful at this hour, with only the occasional birdsong and distant sound of waves breaking against the shore below the hill. Dew clung to the grass, soaking the cuffs of their pants as they made their way to Eleanor's grave. Cassandra stood before the headstone, coffee forgotten in her hand. Her face was unreadable as she studied the simple inscription. "Did you know her?" Thomas asked gently. Cassandra shook her head. "She died 20 years before I was born, but she was always this presence in our house growing up. My Aunt Marion talked about her all the time like she was watching over us." She gave a small, humorless laugh. Not in a comforting way. She set down her coffee and began unpacking her bag. Thomas watched with interest as she removed several small tools, vials, and what looked like a portable electronic device with a screen. "Mind if I ask what you're doing?" "Soil samples," Cassandra replied, kneeling beside the grave. "I'm a geologist. I specialize in soil composition and contamination studies." She glanced up at him. "Before you worry, I'm not disturbing the grave itself, just taking surface samples." "You think something in the soil is causing the glow?" "It's the most logical explanation." She carefully scraped a small amount of soil into a vial. Certain minerals and compounds can exhibit bioluminescence under specific conditions. The recent rain might have triggered a reaction. Thomas nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "And your family? What do they think is happening?" Cassandra's hands stilled momentarily. "My family prefers when things stay buried," she said quietly. She worked methodically for the next hour, taking samples from different areas around the headstone and making notes on a small tablet. Thomas left her to it, attending to his regular duties but keeping an eye on her from a distance. There was something in her focused intensity that impressed him, and something in the tight set of her shoulders that spoke of burden. By mid-morning, the cemetery had a few other visitors, mostly elderly folks tending to family plots. Several cast curious glances toward Cassandra and the now famous grave, but Thomas waved them off with a look that discouraged questions. Cassandra was packing up her equipment when a black luxury car pulled up to the cemetery gates. A tall, gray-haired woman emerged, her posture rigid and her mouth set in a thin line. Even from a distance, the family resemblance was clear. "Looks like your aunt's here," Thomas said, nodding toward the entrance. Cassandra's expression tightened. "Right on schedule," she muttered. The older woman marched up the path toward them, her expensive shoes entirely unsuited for the damp ground. She ignored Thomas completely, her gaze fixed on her niece. "I told you to wait for me before coming here," she said without preamble. "Hello to you too, Aunt Marion," Cassandra replied, continuing to pack her equipment. "It's been, 6 years since we've seen each other?" "Don't play games, Cassandra. What are you doing?" Marion's eyes narrowed at the vials of soil. "My job. I'm analyzing what might be causing the phenomenon people are reporting. This is a family matter. It should be handled privately, not with you poking around taking samples." She spat the last word as if it tasted bad. Thomas cleared his throat. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Thomas Walsh, the groundskeeper. Your niece has been very respectful of the site. This doesn't concern you. Marion cut him off without even looking his way. Cassandra, we need to talk. Not here. Cassandra sighed and zipped her bag closed. Fine. The Harborview Cafe in an hour. I need to drop these samples off first. Marion's lips pressed together even tighter if that was possible. The house. We'll talk at the house. I'm not staying at the house. You're a Blackwood. It's your home too. Cassandra straightened up, meeting her aunt's gaze directly. I haven't been a Blackwood in 15 years by your choice. I'll meet you at the cafe. The two women stared at each other, the tension between them almost visible in the clear morning air. Finally, Marion gave a stiff nod. 1 hour. Don't make me wait. She turned and walked back down the path, her back ramrod straight. When she was out of earshot, Thomas let out a low whistle. Family reunions can be tough. Cassandra gave him a tired smile. The Blackwoods take it to an art form. She shouldered her backpack. Thanks for letting me do this, Mr. Walsh. Thomas, please, and you're welcome. Will you be back tonight when it glows? She nodded. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. As Cassandra walked to her rental car, Thomas found himself wondering just what kind of secrets the Blackwood family was keeping. Whatever they were, they seemed to cast a longer shadow than any headstone in his cemetery. The Harborview Cafe sat on the town's main street, its large windows offering views of the harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently in the water. Once, a working-class diner, it had been renovated in recent years to appeal to summer tourists, with nautical decorations and overpriced seafood sandwiches. In October, though, it was mostly empty aside from a few locals. Cassandra arrived precisely an hour after leaving the cemetery. She chose a corner table with her back to the wall, a habit from years of working in sometimes hostile environments. Through the window she could see gray clouds gathering over the water, promising more rain by evening. Her aunt arrived 5 minutes later, accompanied by a man Cassandra recognized as her cousin Peter. He had been a gangly teenager when she left town. Now he was in his early 30s with the beginning of a paunch and thinning hair. He looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his car keys. I thought this was between us, Cassandra said as they sat down. Peter is part of the family business now, Marion replied. He should be included. A waitress approached, but Marion waved, her away with a gesture that made Cassandra wince internally. Some things never changed. So, Cassandra said after an awkward silence. The glowing grave. When did it start? 2 weeks ago after the big storm. Peter answered, then glanced at his mother as if seeking approval. Marion sighed. This isn't a scientific expedition, Cassandra. It's a family embarrassment that needs to be contained before it draws more attention. Contained? It's an unexplained phenomenon. People are naturally curious. People should mind their own business. Marion snapped. Just like you should have done instead of rushing back here to dig up dirt, literally. Peter shifted uncomfortably. Mom, maybe we should... Not now, Peter. Marion leaned forward, lowering her voice. Listen to me, Cassandra. Whatever you think you're going to discover, leave it alone. Some things are better left in the past. Cassandra felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. Like what happened to my parents? Was that better left in the past too? The color drained from Marion's face. That's not what this is about, isn't it? Everything in this family comes back to secrets and lies. Cassandra leaned forward too, mirroring her aunt's posture. Something is happening at Eleanor's grave, something unusual enough to make national news. I'm going to find out what it is. Why? You turned your back on this family years ago. Why? Come back now? Because unlike you, I believe in finding the truth, not burying it. Peter cleared his throat. The company lawyers think we should put up a fence. Around the grave, I mean. Private property, keep people out. Cassandra raised an eyebrow. The cemetery is town property. The plot itself is technically owned by Blackwood Industries, Marion said. We've maintained the rights. Of course you have. Cassandra shook her head. Let me guess, you're worried this will somehow affect the company's image? God forbid anything interfere with the profit margin. Marion's eyes flashed. You have no idea what's at stake. You ran away to play in dirt while Peter and I kept the family legacy alive. Hundreds of people in this town depend on Blackwood Industries for their livelihoods, and I'm sure they're all properly grateful to the benevolent Blackwoods, Cassandra replied dryly. The tension at the table was broken by the arrival of an elderly man who approached with the help of a cane. His weathered face broke into a smile when he spotted Cassandra. Well, I'll be damned. Little Cass Blackwood, back in town after all these years. Cassandra's expression softened for the first time since entering the cafe. Mr. Reynolds, you're still kicking around this place? Takes more than old age to get rid of me. He nodded to Marion and Peter. Afternoon, folks. Marion's smile was tight. Hello, Frank. We're in the middle of a family discussion. Won't keep you long, the old man said, his eyes twinkling. Just wanted to say hello to Cass here. Your grandmother would be pleased to see you home. Thank you, Cassandra said warmly. It's good to see a friendly face. Frank nodded, then leaned closer. Stop by my place later if you want. Got some things that might interest you. He straightened up with effort. Good day to you all. As he shuffled away, Marion's expression had darkened considerably. Stay away from him, she warned. He's a confused old man who likes to stir up trouble. Cassandra stood up, dropping some bills on the table for a coffee she never ordered. I think I can choose my own friends, Aunt Marion. Always could. She picked up her jacket. I'll be at the cemetery tonight. If you want to put up your fence, you'll have to go through proper channels. As she walked out into the gray afternoon, Cassandra felt the weight of the past settling back onto her shoulders. She had sworn never to return to this town. Yet here she was, drawn back by a mystery that seemed to be pulling at threads she had long tried to forget. Rain began falling again as Cassandra drove through Harborview's familiar streets. The town had changed in the 15 years since she'd left. New shops along Main Street catering to summer tourists, a couple of upscale restaurants where family diners once stood, and a fresh coat of paint on the town hall. But beneath these surface changes, it felt eerily the same. She passed the high school where she'd once been the quiet, serious girl who excelled in science classes, but rarely joined in social activities. The Blackwood name had set her apart, wrapping her in a strange mix of privilege and isolation that had never quite felt comfortable. Her rental car climbed the winding road that led to Frank Reynolds' house. The old Victorian sat on a bluff overlooking the harbor, its white paint peeling and garden overgrown. Frank had been the town's doctor for nearly 40 years before retiring. He'd also been her grandmother's closest friend. He answered the door, before she could knock, as if he'd been watching for her arrival. Didn't think Marion would let you out of her sight, he said with a crooked smile, stepping back to let her in. The house smelled of books and pipe tobacco, though Cassandra knew Frank had given up smoking years ago on his wife's insistence. Old habits left their marks in invisible ways. Aunt Marion doesn't dictate my movements, Cassandra replied, following him into a cluttered living room where books and papers covered nearly every surface. Though not for lack of trying, Frank chuckled. Sit. Tea? Please. He disappeared. Into the kitchen, returning minutes later with 2 steaming mugs. His hands shook slightly as he set them down, a reminder of his advancing age. So, he said, settling into a worn armchair. Eleanor's grave is putting on a light show. Cassandra nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. You've seen it? Once. My old legs don't handle evening cemetery visits well these days. He studied her face carefully. You look like her, you know. Around the eyes. So I've been told. Cassandra took a sip of tea. Mr. Reynolds. Frank, please. You're not 12 anymore. She smiled. Frank, you said you had something that might interest me? The old man nodded, his expression turning serious. I've been waiting years for someone in your family to start asking the right questions. Should have known it would be you. He leaned forward. What do you know about your great-grandmother? Cassandra considered. Not much. She died before I was born. I know she worked as some kind of secretary or assistant at a research facility back in the 50s. My grandfather never talked about her much. Secretary? Frank snorted. That's what they called women with science degrees back then. Eleanor was brilliant. Chemistry, physics, she understood things most of us couldn't grasp. Cassandra set down her mug. I didn't know that. No, you wouldn't have. The Blackwood men have always been good at rewriting history to suit them. Frank stood with effort and crossed to a bookshelf, pulling out an old leather-bound photo album. Your great-grandmother was part of the Harbor Point Research Station team, government-funded, very hush-hush during the Cold War. He opened the album to reveal a black-and-white photograph of a group of people in white lab coats standing in front of a concrete building. Frank pointed to a woman on the end, tall, slim, with dark hair pulled back severely from her face. That's Eleanor, one of 3 women on a team of 20 scientists. Cassandra stared at the face of her great-grandmother, seeing for the first time the family resemblance Frank had mentioned. There was something in Eleanor's eyes, a sharpness, an intensity, that felt familiar, like looking in a mirror across decades. What were they researching? She asked. Frank's expression grew troubled. Officially, energy applications. Unofficially, well, this was the height of the nuclear age. Lots of things were happening that never made it into public records. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside crept up Cassandra's spine. Are you suggesting the government was conducting nuclear experiments here, in Harborview? Not weapons testing, if that's what you're thinking, but research into materials. Disposal methods, long-term storage, yes. Frank turned a page in the album. The facility closed in 1964, officially decommissioned and cleared. Eleanor died 9 years later. Cassandra's scientific mind began making connections. If there was radioactive material, Frank nodded. It would explain a grave that suddenly starts glowing, wouldn't it? But after all these years, and why now? Those are the right questions. Frank closed the album. Eleanor asked questions too many according to some. He stood again and walked to an old roll-top desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer he removed a small wooden box. Before she died, Eleanor gave this to my wife for safekeeping. Made her promise not to give it to anyone but a female descendant who came asking questions. He placed the box in Cassandra's hands. I think she was waiting for you. The box was heavier than it looked, its dark wood smooth from age. A small brass lock held it closed. The key? Cassandra asked. Frank shook his head. Eleanor said her granddaughter would know how to open it. I'm her great-granddaughter. Bloodlines matter less than spirit, she used to say. Cassandra turned the box in her hands, examining it from all angles. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with tiny carved flowers along the edges. She ran her fingers over them, counting. 12 flowers total, arranged in a pattern that seemed familiar somehow. These flowers, she murmured. They're not random. Frank watched her with interest. No. It's the periodic table. Excitement crept into her voice. These 12 flowers, they're arranged like elements. Look, these 4 here form a perfect square like carbon, and these, the atomic structure of phosphorus. Her fingers pressed the centers of the flowers in sequence, carbon, phosphorus, argon, oxygen. With a soft click, the lock released. Frank smiled. Like I said, she was waiting for you. Inside the box lay a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Cassandra opened it carefully, finding dense handwriting filling every page. Tucked inside the cover was a photograph, Eleanor standing beside a tall man in a suit, both looking serious. My grandfather, Cassandra identified, recognizing the man from family photos. Robert Blackwood, Frank confirmed. Eleanor's son, and the man who built Blackwood Industries into what it is today. Cassandra began to skim the journal entries, her breath catching as certain phrases leaped out at her. Chemical waste, unauthorized disposal, contaminated water table, cover-up. She looked up at Frank, her face pale. This is serious. Eleanor thought so too, No one would listen. These entries suggest that the research facility was dumping chemical and radioactive waste improperly, and that my grandfather knew about it. Her voice hardened. That the Blackwoods profited from it. Frank nodded solemnly. Your family's factory was originally built to manufacture specialized containers for the research station. Later, they expanded into other areas, but that government contract was what started it all. Cassandra continued reading, turning pages with increasing urgency. She suspected she was being poisoned. The words came out barely above a whisper. Many people who worked at the station developed unusual illnesses. Nothing that could be proven. Of course. Frank's voice held old bitterness. I was just starting my practice then. I saw the patterns, but any time I raised concerns, I was shut down. Cassandra closed the journal, her mind racing. If what she wrote is true, there could still be contamination affecting the town. The recent storms might have disturbed old deposit sites, bringing elements to the surface. She looked at Frank intently. This could explain the glowing grave, some combination of compounds reacting with rainwater seepage. That's the scientist in you talking, Frank said with a sad smile. The old-timers in town might say it's Eleanor, finally finding a way to make her voice heard. Cassandra carefully returned the journal to its box. I need to run more tests, and I need to get into the Blackwood house. Eleanor's personal effects might still be there. Marion won't make that easy. No, she won't. Cassandra stood, tucking the box securely into her bag. Thank you for keeping this safe all these years. Frank walked her to the door, moving slower now as if the conversation had drained him. Be careful, Cassandra. The Blackwoods protect their own. Unless you're the one asking uncomfortable questions. Eleanor found that out the hard way. Rain had given way to fog, thick and clinging. As Cassandra drove back down the hill, the town's lights blurred into hazy halos. She checked her watch. Still 3 hours until sunset when the grave would glow again. She made a decision and turned toward the outskirts of town, where the Blackwood family home stood on 10 manicured acres. It was time to confront the past directly. The house appeared through the fog like something from another era. A sprawling, Victorian mansion with a wide porch and too many gables to count. Cassandra had grown up in this house, running through its endless rooms and hiding in window seats with books. She'd never felt at home here. As she pulled into the circular driveway, she noticed Peter's car but not her aunt's. Small mercies. Her cousin would be easier to handle alone. He answered the door in sock feet, looking surprised. Cassandra, Mom's not here. I know. I saw her car at the office. Can I come in? He hesitated, then stepped back. Sure, I guess. The house smelled exactly as she remembered, furniture polish and the faint mustiness of a place too large for the people living in it. Family portraits lined the entry hall, generations of Blackwood staring down with the same serious expressions. Need to see Eleanor's things? Cassandra said without preamble. Peter's eyebrows shot up. What things? She died 50 years ago. Her personal items, papers, research, anything that might have been kept. Cassandra looked her cousin directly in the eye. I know they're here somewhere. Aunt Marion never throws anything away, especially family history. Peter shifted uncomfortably. Look, Mom would kill me if I went digging through the storage rooms without her permission. Peter, something strange is happening at that grave. Don't you want to know why? Mom says it's probably kids playing pranks, or maybe some chemical reaction from all the rain we've had. He didn't sound convinced. And you believe that? Peter sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. What I believe doesn't matter much in this family. Never has. There was something in his tone, a resignation, a hint of the same frustration she'd felt growing up, that made Cassandra soften her approach. I remember, she said quietly. That's why I left. They stood in silence for a moment, two people shaped by the same family pressures in very different ways. The attic, Peter finally said. 3rd floor, east wing. There are some trunks with her name on them. Mom had them, moved up there after Grandpa died. Thank you. Cassandra started toward the grand staircase, then paused. Peter, have you ever wondered if the Blackwood success was built on something wrong? Her cousin wouldn't meet her eyes. We employ half the town, Cass. We fund the hospital wing, the library, the scholarship program. Whatever happened in the past, look at the good the family does now. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. He turned away. Lock the door when you leave. The Blackwood family attic was a museum of forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the weak light coming through small dormer windows as Cassandra made her way between stacks of furniture draped in yellowed sheets. The air felt heavy with age and secrets. She found the trunks in the far corner. 3 wooden chests with brass fittings, each marked with a small nameplate, Eleanor Blackwood. Cassandra ran her fingers over the cool metal letters, feeling an unexpected connection to the woman who had left behind so many breadcrumbs for someone to follow. The first trunk contained clothing, dresses with narrow waists and full skirts, blouses with modest necklines, all preserved in tissue paper that crackled when she lifted them. The second held household items, a silver hairbrush set, framed photographs, delicate teacups wrapped in newspaper dated 1973, the year Eleanor died. The third trunk was locked. Cassandra examined it carefully. Unlike the simple padlocks on the other trunks, this one had an unusual mechanism, a combination dial with letters instead of numbers. She tried Eleanor's name, then Robert's. Nothing. She sat back on her heels, thinking. The wooden box, Frank, had given her sat at her side. She opened it again, studying Eleanor's journal more closely. Near the back, she found a page where certain letters were underlined in the text, seemingly random, but when put together they spelled isotope. Worth a try, she murmured, turning the dial to each letter. With the final E, the lock clicked. Open inside lay what Cassandra had been hoping for, files, notebooks, and folders filled with papers. She lifted out the first file, labeled Harbor Point Research Station, Personnel. Inside were photographs and brief bios of the scientists who had worked there, including Eleanor. Unlike the official photo Frank had shown her, these seemed to be casual snapshots. Men and women in lab coats laughing together, gathering around equipment, sharing meals in a cafeteria. Eleanor appeared in many of them, often slightly apart from the group, her expression more serious than the others. In one photo, she stood beside a complex piece of equipment making notes on a clipboard. The caption, written in her handwriting, read, "Testing soil samples from Site C, concerning results." The next folder contained maps, detailed drawings, of the area around Harborview, with certain locations marked in red. One was the research station itself, now demolished and replaced by a shopping center. Others were scattered around the town's perimeter, including one spot unsettlingly close to the town's reservoir. Disposal sites, Cassandra whispered, a chill running through her. She checked the date on the maps, 1962. The third folder was thicker than the others, labeled simply Evidence. Inside were laboratory reports, soil analysis results, and water quality tests, all meticulously documented in Eleanor's precise handwriting. Technical terms jumped out at Cassandra, her scientific training allowing her to understand the implications: contamination, radioactive isotopes, chemical leaching, groundwater penetration. Attached to each report was a memo showing Eleanor had submitted these findings to her superiors, and paperclipped to each memo was a response dismissing her concerns, calling for more testing, or suggesting her methodology was flawed. The final paper in the folder was a letter on official government stationery, dated 1964, announcing the closure of the Harbor Point facility and the successful completion of all research objectives. A handwritten note in the margin in Eleanor's writing said simply, "They're burying it all, God help us." Cassandra sat back, her mind racing. This was explosive information, evidence that dangerous materials had been improperly disposed of around Harborview decades ago, potentially still affecting the soil and water. And her family, her grandfather specifically, appeared to have been complicit in covering it up. A noise downstairs startled her. Voices, her aunt's among them. Quickly, Cassandra gathered the most important documents, slipping them into her bag alongside Eleanor's journal. She closed the trunk and relocked it, then made her way toward the attic stairs. She paused at the top, hearing her aunt's voice more clearly now. "I don't care what," she said. "The cemetery is closing at sunset tonight. No more visitors. And I want security posted at Eleanor's grave." "The mayor won't like it," came a male voice Cassandra didn't recognize. "People are coming from 3 counties over to see this thing. Local businesses are loving the tourism boost." "The mayor will do as he's told if he wants Blackwood Industries to continue funding the town's infrastructure projects," Marion snapped. "This circus ends tonight." Cassandra waited until the voices moved away, then slipped down the stairs and out a side door. The fog had thickened as evening approached, wrapping the grounds in a ghostly blanket that provided welcome cover as she made her way back to her car. Back at her hotel room, Cassandra spread the documents across the bed and began organizing them chronologically. A narrative emerged, a story of scientific discovery, growing concern, and ultimately, a cover-up with potentially deadly consequences. Eleanor had discovered that waste materials from the research station were being disposed of in unmarked locations around Harborview. When her concerns were dismissed by the facility management, she began her own investigation, documenting contamination levels and tracking unusual illness patterns in the town. The most disturbing document was a private letter Eleanor had written to Robert, her son, pleading with him to stop manufacturing the containers used to transport these materials, warning him they were substandard and leaking. His response was a cold legal letter, threatening to cut her off financially if she continued making unfounded allegations that could damage the company's reputation. As Cassandra read more, she began to understand why Eleanor's grave might be glowing now. The documents indicated that one of the largest disposal sites was less than a quarter-mile from the cemetery, uphill. The recent heavy rains and flooding could have disturbed the soil enough to cause migration of certain compounds. If they reached Eleanor's grave, the irony was almost too perfect. The very phenomena she had warned about literally illuminating her final resting place. But there was something even more troubling in Eleanor's personal notes. In the last year of her life, she had documented her own symptoms: hair loss, unexpected bruising, chronic fatigue, nausea. She suspected she was suffering from radiation poisoning, either from her work at the facility, or more disturbingly, from deliberate exposure meant to silence her. "They think I don't notice when my tea tastes different," she had written. "Robert comes by every Sunday, always insisting on pouring for me himself. A mother knows when her child is hiding something." The implication was clear. Eleanor believed her own son, Cassandra's grandfather, was slowly poisoning her to prevent her from exposing the truth about the contamination and his company's role in it. Cassandra's phone chimed with a text from Thomas, the cemetery groundskeeper. "Crowd gathering already. Your aunt sent men to put up fencing. I stalled them. Better come quick." She gathered the most crucial documents, securing them in a waterproof folder before heading out. The rain had started again, falling in a fine mist that blurred the streetlights as she drove toward the cemetery. The scene that greeted her was chaotic. Despite the weather, at least 50 people had gathered, many with umbrellas, all focused on the hill where Eleanor's grave lay. Local police were trying to establish a perimeter while workers in Blackwood Industries jackets unloaded metal fencing from a truck. Cassandra spotted Thomas arguing with a police officer near the cemetery gates. She parked and hurried over. "They're claiming it's a public safety issue," Thomas told her, gesturing toward the workers. "Got some kind of emergency order signed by the mayor." "My aunt works fast," Cassandra muttered. "The glowing started early tonight," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "Brighter than before, people are saying it's spreading to the surrounding ground." Cassandra pushed through the crowd, ignoring the police officer who called for her to stop. As she crested the hill, she saw it, a blue glow more intense than the night before, spreading in a rough circle around Eleanor's grave. The light pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat. She knelt beside the headstone, pulling out a small device from her pocket, a radiation detector she'd borrowed from a local university's geology department that afternoon. The needle jumped immediately, not into the danger zone, but definitely registering above normal background levels. "Miss, you need to step back," came a firm voice. A police officer stood over her, rain dripping from his hat brim. "This area is being closed for safety concerns." "I'm a geologist specializing in soil contamination," Cassandra replied, standing her ground. "And I'm also Eleanor Blackwood's great-granddaughter. This is my family's grave." Nevertheless, "Officer Diaz," called a sharp voice. Aunt Marion appeared through the crowd, umbrella held aloft, Peter trailing behind her. "My niece is trespassing and interfering with a safety operation." "I'm not trespassing in a public cemetery," Cassandra countered. "And this isn't about safety. It's about hiding evidence." The crowd had grown quiet, watching the confrontation with interest. Cassandra noticed several people had phones out. "Recording." "Evidence of what?" the officer asked, looking confused. Cassandra made a split-second decision. With so many witnesses, including people recording, it might be her only chance to get the truth out before her aunt shut everything down. "Evidence of decades of environmental contamination," she said loudly, addressing not just the officer but the crowd. "Radioactive and chemical waste dumped around this town in the 1950s and 60s. My great-grandmother discovered it and tried to warn people." She pointed at the glowing soil. "This is proof she was right." Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Marion's face had gone pale with fury. "That's a ridiculous claim," she snapped. "Officer, remove her immediately." "I have documents," Cassandra continued, pulling the waterproof folder from inside her jacket. "Research station reports, disposal site maps, soil tests, all showing dangerous materials were improperly disposed of around Harborview, and evidence that Blackwood Industries not only knew about it but helped cover it up." Peter stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Cassandra, think about what you're doing. This affects the whole town." "Yes, it does," she agreed. "Everyone has a right to know if their soil and water have been contaminated for generations. Everyone has a right to know if their health problems might be connected to what's buried under their feet." Marion pushed forward, her voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're meddling with. Your grandfather built this town. Without Blackwood Industries, these people have nothing." "They have the truth," Cassandra replied, "something this family has been burying for too long." As if responding to her words, the blue glow around Eleanor's grave pulsed brighter, casting their faces in an eerie light. In that moment, with the rain falling softly around them and the crowd watching in silence, Cassandra felt as if her great-grandmother was finally being heard. The next morning broke clear and cold. The storm finally passed. Sunlight sparkled on wet leaves and puddles as Cassandra made her way to the town hall. Last night's confrontation at the cemetery had ended in an uneasy truce. The police had cleared everyone out, including the Blackwood Industries workers, with their fencing, promising a town meeting to address the concerns Cassandra had raised. Word had spread quickly. As she approached the building, Cassandra saw a crowd already gathering outside. Familiar faces from her childhood mixed with strangers, all sharing the same worried expressions. A local news van was parked across the street, a reporter doing a stand-up with the town hall in the background. Thomas waved to her from the steps. "Quite a turnout," he said as she joined him. "Haven't seen the town this stirred up since the harbor development proposal back in '08. "Is my aunt here yet?" Cassandra asked, scanning the crowd. "Inside with the mayor and town council. Been there since dawn." Thomas lowered his voice. "Peter called me this morning. Said you should know your aunt was on the phone half the night with lawyers." Cassandra nodded, unsurprised. "I expected that." What she hadn't expected was the sick feeling in her stomach as she watched more townspeople arrive. These were people she'd grown up with, neighbors who'd watched her learn to ride a bike, teachers who'd encouraged her interest in science. If what Eleanor's documents suggested was true, many of them might have been unknowingly living with the health effects of contamination for decades. "You okay?" Thomas asked, noticing her expression. Just wondering if I'm doing the right thing, she admitted. This could change everything for Harborview. Truth has a way of doing that. Thomas gestured toward the doors. Shall we? The town hall's main meeting room was already packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. At the front, behind a long table, sat the mayor, flanked by town council members. Marion and Peter occupied seats to one side, Marion's face set in rigid lines while Peter stared at his hands. On the other side sat Frank Reynolds, and surprisingly, several elderly men and women Cassandra recognized as former employees of the research station. Frank caught her eye and gave a slight nod. The mayor, a balding man with an expensive suit that seemed at odds with the small-town setting, called the meeting to order. We're here to address concerns about potential environmental contamination related to the former Harbor Point research station, he began, his tone suggesting he found the whole thing overblown. Ms. Blackwood has made some significant claims, and in the interest of transparency, we've agreed to hear them publicly. Cassandra made her way to the front, conscious of every eye in the room on her. She placed Eleanor's folder of documents on the table and took a deep breath. Thank you, Mayor Wilson. What I'm about to share isn't easy, especially since it involves my own family. But I believe the health and safety of Harborview's residents must come before anything else, including family loyalty or business interests. She opened the folder and began methodically presenting the evidence she'd found: the disposal site maps, the contamination test results, the correspondence showing attempts to silence Eleanor's concerns. As she spoke, she displayed key documents on the projector screen, highlighting the most damning sections. These disposal sites, she explained, pointing to the map, were never properly contained according to even the standards of the time. The waste included not only industrial chemicals but radioactive materials from experiments conducted at the research station. My great-grandmother's tests showed leaching into groundwater as early as 1962. A murmur ran through the crowd. Cassandra continued, her voice steady. The Harbor Point facility was closed abruptly in 1964, officially due to budget cuts. But Eleanor's notes suggest the real reason was growing concern about containment failures and potential public health implications. Rather than address these problems properly, the decision was made to simply shut down operations and bury the evidence. Literally, she turned to face her aunt. Blackwood Industries, then run by my grandfather Robert Blackwood, was contracted to handle the closure process. The company provided storage containers that Eleanor had identified as substandard and likely to leak over time. When she raised these concerns, she was ignored, threatened, and eventually, according to her personal journals, deliberately exposed to harmful substances to silence her. Gasps filled the room. Marion stood up, her face flushed. This is slander. You have no proof my father did any such thing. I have Eleanor's medical records, Cassandra replied calmly, showing symptoms consistent with radiation exposure. I have her documented attempts to warn him about the containers, and I have this. She held up a faded photograph. This is the cemetery taken in 1970, 3 years before Eleanor died. If you look closely at her plot, which she purchased herself, you can see the soil was already slightly discolored. 43 key for a nunning.